Frances Morris ist Direktorin der Sammlung International Art an der Tate Modern und verantwortet das Erwerbungsprogramm der Tate, und zwar für internationale Kunst von 1900 bis heute. Zuvor war sie als Head of Displays bereits von 2000 bis 2007 an der Tate für die Präsentation der Sammlung zuständig. Wichtige Ausstellungen und Kataloge widmete sie beispielsweise Henri Rousseau 2005, David Smith 2006, Louise Bourgeois 2007, Yayoi Kusama 2012 und schließlich 2015 Agnes Martin. Darüber hinaus kuratierte sie thematische Ausstellungen wie Paris Post-War, Art and Existentialism 1993, Rites of Passage 1995, eine Zero-Ausstellung 2001 und sie ist als Spezialistin für europäische Nachkriegskunst und internationale zeitgenössische Kunst, zudem Kuratorin zahlreicher Projekte zeitgenössischer Künstler wie Miroslav Balka, Chris Burden, Sophie Kall, Mark Dion, Luciano Fabro, Paul McCarthy und anderen. Und zum Schluss, ich habe es ja eben schon mal kurz erwähnt, fiel im Januar 2016 die Entscheidung, dass Frances im Laufe des Jahres die Direktorin der Tate Modern wird, in Nachfolge von Chris Durkin, der ja, das ist glaube ich keinem verborgen geblieben, nach Berlin zum Theater geht. Frances ist maßgeblich, oder ja, ich glaube, der Initiatorin dieses wunderbaren Ausstellungsprojektes, und sie wird uns einige Gedanken darlegen, die dazu geführt haben, dass die Ausstellung eben diesen Korpus von Bildern enthält, und über die Präsentation in London und Düsseldorf sprechen. Und ihr folgt dann Tiffany Bell, die, auch das haben Sie schon gehört, ja die Herausgeberin des Katalog Raisonné ist, in New York lebt und arbeitet und die eben als Co-Kuratorin ich finde, das Co macht es immer so klein, das ist, glaube ich, wir lassen das Co weg und es waren einfach beide und Lena Fritsch dazu, an dieser Retrospektive mitgearbeitet haben. Zuvor war sie Direktorin des Dan Flevin Katalog Raisonné-Projekts, das 2004 mit der Publikation Dan Flevin, The Complete Lights, abgeschlossen wurde. In den letzten Jahren hat sie zudem für zahlreiche Museums- und Galerieausstellungen Flevins Lichtinstallationen kuratiert. Tiffany wird den kuratorischen Blick ergänzen, um all die Fragen, die sich verbinden mit diesem unglaublichen Steinbruchprojekt. Wir machen einen Katalog Raisonné, und es sind also sozusagen sich ergänzende Perspektiven, und jetzt bin ich fertig und begrüße sehr herzlich Frances Morris.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Mona. It's thrilling to be here. This is, for me, it's the first time I've seen this exhibition outside of Tate Modern. I wasn't able to come to the opening, and I knew it had been beautifully installed because Lena and Tiffany both came back and regaled me with the stories of its transcendent beauty. But I was very pleased actually to see that much of the kind of curatorial framework survived the trip to Europe, and that what you're seeing in Düsseldorf, although more expansive and certainly more beautifully lit upstairs with daylight, is more or less the kind of curatorial concept that Tiffany and I worked on from the start. I've called this a short, I hope short, presentation, Innocence and Experience, because that's how we approached the project as curators, me with all my innocence of Agnes Martin and Tiffany with all her experience of Agnes Martin. I came to Agnes Martin exhausted and battered from the experience of working with Yayoi Kusama, and before that working with Louise Bourgeois, and I was looking for a serene, easy ride. I wanted beauty and peace, elegance, transcendence, and no trouble, and of course that was before I read Arnie's book. And then I realized that behind all that beauty and innocence lay a very, very troubled mind. And as part of the 2 years of research that we did together with Tiffany and Lena, I did spend a couple of weeks in New Mexico and kind of met the troubled mind head on, which was an interesting experience through encounters with many of the people that Agnes had lived with in that place. But more seriously, the room is, I'm sure, full of art historians, and Mona talked a lot about research. And of course, art history can draw on any image. Ever since the days of reproduction, any image of any work is available to the art historian, but as a curator, you really have to think about telling a story through objects. So really the project for Tiffany and myself was to identify a story through objects and bring those objects together in a kind of meaningful way. And to do that in the first instance for London. And London is a particular city in a particular part of the world. It's very far from the desert location of Martin's mature years. And interestingly, I think my innocence of Martin was rather paralleled by the innocence of audiences in London. One of the reasons we did Agnes Martin as an exhibition was because we have a commitment to exploring and celebrating and bringing to the public's attention artists who make great work but are perhaps less known than they should be, and Martin very much fell into that category. Of course, she'd never had had not had a full-scale retrospective since the 1990s, so even internationally the full scope of her work was unknown, but particularly so, I think, less known in the UK than her work might be in Europe. And she was especially known in England for the group of late paintings that are in the Artists' Room collection, which is a collection jointly owned by the National Galleries of Scotland and Tate. And this is an installation of those paintings in the space that normally houses our Rothko room in London. So the public, our visitors to Tate, are familiar with this room, and it's a group of paintings that have travelled extensively around the UK. And aside from those late paintings, the other painting that is very well known in the UK is this very beautiful painting from the mid-1960s called Morning. And this is a work that we've had in the collection since the mid-1970s, and that we have always shown in a minimalist, the context of American minimalism. And I have to say, as somebody who's worked with the display of the collection over many years, this is the painting that everybody walks past. So one of the targets, one of the aims of the exhibition that we really established right at the onset was that the aim of the show was to get people to stop and look. Much of the literature around Agnes Martin, of course, is about her enigmatic personal stature, her silent figure, revered by artists, and much of the writing around her work is about the experience of looking at the work. There's a language of meditation, of inspiration, of her isolation, silence, qualities of light and landscape. And we wanted to embrace all of that, but really allow people to look and go through looking to understand the process of making. Because through the literature, it's not a big literature, there are, of course, glimpses of another Martin, and that Martin is a tough personality, urban, forceful, a maker. And I love this image. There's a one from this series. Is it this one? Well, okay, this image is in the exhibition, and you see her in New York in the 1960s. It's a very different kind of depiction of the artist from that light-filled desert studio. And, of course, other glimpses of Agnes Martin, who, although in speaking about her work and speaking about her context, always distanced herself from relationships with other people. She spoke of inspiration rather than context, rarely spoke of influence beyond references to the two artists she revered most, Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko. But, of course, there are glimpses in the photographic archives and in anecdotes of her close relationship with a community of New York artists in the late 1950s and the 1960s. So here you see her slightly recessive figure in the street shot of Ellsworth Kelly and Robert Indiana. So the challenge as a curator really was to encounter the work, decide what stories we wanted to tell, and to do as much research as we could. And of course, this allied very closely with Tiffany's work on the catalogue Resnais. And the important tip I learned from Tiffany early on is never be without a magnifying glass when you're looking at Agnes Martin. And we did some amazing trips to Paris, to Germany, we went to New York, we went to Philadelphia, and we went through New Mexico. And we always had the magnifying glass and a very smart camera with us so that we could capture the close-up as well as the long distance of the paintings. And one of the things I think that I found very early on was just how rewarding and insightful close looking of the paintings was. And it was really through close looking at the paintings that I began to realize that there was an enormous amount of skill, of erudition, of learning, of knowledge about art history, and experimentation in the work. And what is one of the nicest parts of the exhibition, to my mind, both at London and here, is that small selection of work from the very late 1950s to the early 60s, where you can almost see in the selection of works how Martin is experimenting with different ways of doing very abstract things like getting to the edge of the painting. If you've designed a grid, how do you get the grid to the edge of the painting? And in this case of this painting, which was very beautifully installed with the Marcel Bruters, which I thought it kind of was an interesting juxtaposition in this collector's house because it was so much about materiality. But in this painting, you can, when you look close up, you can see that she's kind of wiped away the paint that sits underneath the spots. And in other paintings, you can see right on the edge there, it's all about edge. And then another painting like this, I'm very sorry for the bad reproduction. See, we've got a detail. You can see how where in this painting, the ink is actually, bleeding into the canvas. So beyond all that talk about inspiration and kind of almost the way Martin talks about painting almost in a kind of automatous sense, there is this incredible finesse, a carefulness, attention to detail, a real thinking of how to make those gestures and how to marry the material that she puts on with the support material. We did a pretty amazing road trip to New Mexico, and we spent some time in Taos, where Agnes Martin spent the last years of her life, and we both there encountered works from the end of her life, but also from the very beginning of her life. And this is the back of this is an early painting which was painted both sides. And one of the key curatorial questions for us was whether we would include the kind of juvenilia, the early work of Agnes Martin. And we came to an early decision that we probably would not include these rather Cézannesque paintings where there's little to see of the signature of Agnes Martin in these paintings. So we were more interested in beginning with the advent of kind of pure abstraction in her work. This is a work that we didn't include in our exhibition, but I liked the idea, as you can see, this is a mountain landscape. And then by the late 1940s, the mountain landscape has sort of turned into these strong triangular motifs. And when we began to look at details of many of the paintings in this era, we began to see the repetition of some of those motifs. I don't know whether those of you who've seen the exhibition noticed in the drawings room and in the last room, this sort of double triangle is something that features over and over again in her work. And in this one, for example, in 2003, in that retrospective moment. And this was something that very early on in that trip, we realized that there was a sort of circularity to Martin's work, that she came back to very early motifs later on. And that gave us the idea of using that in our last room to make those references across time. But of course, when you drive through the desert, those kind of motifs are inescapably present. And everywhere I went in New Mexico, I seemed to find this sort of double triangular mountain. And I don't know whether that's just me reading things into the landscape, but the triangles of the mountains, and then this insistent regularity and repetition and linearity and horizontality, whether it's subliminal or not, I think does, sit behind Martin's work. We were fortunate enough to visit the home where Agnes Martin had lived for many years near Galisteo, just a normal house. But we were able to see the studio that Martin built for herself on the property owned by Donald Woodsman, a photographer now married to Judy Chicago. And this was a place where we began to encounter some of the people Agnes Martin had known, and neighbours and later friends from Taos. And of course, this is when I began to realise, I think Tiffany had done many trips in advance of my visit, just how Martin had, although retreated to New Mexico, just how embedded she had been in a community of people, how many friends she had, how many friends had supported her, that this, in a way, the portrayal of isolation that she herself promoted in her, or perhaps that's the wrong word, that she articulated in her many interviews, was in fact, part countered by this sense of community that she very much belonged to at that time. And this is a picture of the inside of the studio at Galisteo, now occupied by a student renting the space. We spent also a lot of time looking at paintings. This is a group of paintings from the mid-90s that Martin gave to Harvard Museum. And there's a lovely anecdote. Around this time, Martin had her first major retrospective at the Whitney Museum. And I talked to Mark Glimpscher, Arnie Glimpscher's son, who was close to Martin when he lived down in New Mexico at that time. And he took Agnes Martin around the exhibition. And apparently they got to the end of the exhibition and she turned to Mark and she said, "My, they all look the same." And yes, they do all look the same, but of course as soon as you give them more than a cursory glance and you soon spend time with them, you realise that there's infinitesimal differences between every line, every stripe, every painting, every edge. And we had a wonderful afternoon in this room with art historian Bryony Fair and Tiffany's magnifying glass, and really just looking at the very subtly different ways that Martin painted her lines. And in fact, although she spoke about her technique, it was much richer, much fuller, and much more nuanced than anything that she felt able to share with her interviewers. So you get pencil lines like this which go over the paint and divide colour from colour, but also interesting ways of using masking tape laid over paint to create this sort of deliberately bird edge. So an enormous amount of kind of textuality, even within a very sort of narrow register of everything looking the same. I just thought I'd show you this because although we know the very experimental work from the 1960s, this is a rug that was made later. And I don't know who made this rug. It was shown to me by an architect in New Mexico. But it was interesting that the references to fabric that people so often make in Martin's work then subsequently were put into kind of production. One of the things that I found extremely interesting about spending time with her archive in Taos was that for the first time I was able to read a lot of her writings in the context of the publications in which they took place. There's a great tendency now, I'm sure all of you who do your research, to download articles from the website or get them sent to you from libraries, and they don't come in the original packaging. And so this is the 1973 issue of Art Forum, which is a really kind of a bumper episode, what's the word? An edition devoted to Martin, but the context of its other contents was revelatory. I'd always had this idea of a kind of some relationship between Agnes Martin and the Greek artist Chryssa, who she had been very close to in New York, and somehow the content of the art forum devoted to Agnes Martin with this reference to a Chryssa exhibition cemented that idea as something that we should explore. And also the reference to Ellsworth Kelly. And even though we were in the desert and a long way from New York, it was that visit that really made me very excited about trying to put Martin back into the context of her time and the friendships and the influences that really helped make her work. So when I went back to New York, as part of my research, I made a number of visits, and one of the ones that I found most useful was to the Lenore-Tawney estate. And Lenore-Tawney was a innovative, about the same age, fibre artist who was living in the same neighbourhood as Martin, very close. In fact, they shared a building for a number of years, and they were very close friends. And I believe that Lenore probably supported Martin financially, but there are some beautiful manuscripts, documents in the archive, including this one, which is the only text that Martin ever wrote about another artist's work. And what was so beautiful about it is it's almost as if she's speaking about her own work. Tawney was crucial, I think, in supporting Martin during that period. She acquired many of the experimental works that Martin made at that time, bought them through Betty Parsons, and you can see in this image of Tawney's studio on the right-hand side the Laws, a very major, I think Martin's largest work that she made with found objects at that time. And I love the way that this grid in the middle of Tawney's studio, as you can see, is actually a grid with threads on it. And it seems to me, and I think other people now, that there's an inescapable connection of influence, mutual influence between those two artists at that time. This is a picture of the Laws from 1958. One of the frustrating things about making an exhibition is you make discoveries that you can't use in your exhibition. And this is an extraordinary and enigmatic letter that Lenore sent to Agnes. Agnes sent to Lenore in 1963, thanking her and saying that that she'd changed her life. An incredible expression of gratitude. It's going to be like the waves over and over again. I can't thank you enough. Something had happened at that time. Lenore had rescued her, had supported her, had loved her. And I'd like to think this painting that we were able to have in our show, but unfortunately could not travel to Düsseldorf, entitled Friendship, might somehow reflect the relationship between those two artists. But more tangibly, when you look at Martin's drawings, and this is from a group of drawings that Martin's dealer, Robert Elcon, left to his widow, Dorothea Elcon, and she's lent to the show. If you look at some of the details of the way that Martin was drawing using her line at that time, there are, it seems to me, inescapable connections with the kind of innovative weaving patterns that Lenore was experimenting with in her work. We also were able to track down this incredible sculpture, which you've seen in the exhibition here, Burning Tree. Martin resisted a celebration or examination of this work in the second part of her career. Once she got to her late work, she sought to destroy much of this work and certainly wouldn't have been happy with the exhibition, I think, as we've presented it today. But it seemed to us incredibly important that in order to understand the late work and its ethereality and really understand this notion of inspiration, kind of metaphorically more than actually, one had to go back to the very early years of Martin and see this trajectory, this journey to the grid. And so after that journey to the grid, which you see in the downstairs part of this exhibition, Agnes decided to take a break, leave town. In fact, she was going to give up painting forever. And this is a letter that we found in the Lenore's Tawney archive. Dear Lenore, I must give independence a trial. I will have to have more time. I'm thinking about you too, with love. And with that, she left New York, and there was a gap of some years in her career. That is a moment at Tate when we went from south to north in the exhibition, and here in this exhibition it's a moment where you move upstairs. So this is travelling through time here, up the building. At Tate it was across the building, kind of from darkness into daylight, and I think it's beautiful that that transition has been preserved in this exhibition. I'm not going to talk about the installation that we made in London because it's so complementary with the exhibition here, but I just want to come back to this Our Opening Room, which is very much like the opening room here, because although our exhibition is all about the materiality of her practice and repositioning her as an artist that is very much about materiality, experimentalism, production, paint on canvas, nails on boards, there is something, I think, ultimately, and I say this as somebody who's an extremely pragmatic person, that does feel transcendent, that does feel beautiful, that does feel extraordinary, that can't be put into words, and there'll be an awful lot of words said over the next few days here. And in a way, this is what the first room in the exhibition was about, to stop you talking, to ask you to be still, to ask you to look and just be absorbed in the canvas as you might be absorbed in the desert. So we opened our exhibition with this room, and I'm thrilled to see that Düsseldorf opens the exhibition here with a similar room, and I imagine by tomorrow evening we'll want to just go back to that room and have a bit of quiet time. And now I'm going to hand over to Experience. Thank you.